or actually, what am I saying, next June, next month, we have the St. Petersburg Forum. And 81 nations are going to join the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They're all going to join and begin seriously examining the alternative to the dollar-dominated financial system, which looks like some sort of currency or basket of currencies, all of which are backed by gold. Now, this de-dollarization is very serious. And the United States government knows it, but no one in Washington will mention it. So there are really two things happening right now. You have a financial war between the United States, its allies, and Russia, China, and the other 81, 82, 83 countries out there who want to de-dollarize. Then you also have the war on the ground in Ukraine. We appear to be losing both. And that's beginning to sink in. But again, the American people, and you know this from your experience here, very few Americans pay very much attention to anything beyond their borders. That's the bad news. And the bad news, in addition to that, is that as a result, they tend to abdicate responsibility for the conduct of their affairs to a small minority of people in Washington who've been able to get away literally with murder. Well, I think that's going to continue until we have a real serious crisis that no one can avoid talking about. I think that's going to have a lot to do with the banking system, our financial system, the international financial system. Those things are closing in on us. As far as the military is concerned, there's a sudden awakening that we can't recruit. We have this very unhappy military establishment filled with people that are not terribly interested in becoming woke, who recognize that that's essentially the death of discipline, the death of effectiveness. All of these things seem to be coming together in sort of a perfect storm, if you will. And all of that is going to undermine what we've been undertaking in Ukraine. And I think to some extent, President Putin and his advisors know this. And I think that's why they've tread cautiously. Because if I look back on the last year plus, if there's one thing we can say about the Russian approach to this whole business, it's extreme caution. There has been a desire to avoid giving us an excuse to intervene militarily. I think that's worked well, but now I think it's dawning on people in Washington that even if we wanted to intervene in it, it wouldn't go well for us. And so they're sobering up. And again, that explains this new focus on China. Let's start talking about China. Let's talk less about Ukraine. And in the meantime, what do we do about the debt? What do we do about financing and the 120% debt to GDP ratio? Those things are beginning to take precedence. So it looks like Putin's caution has paid off in that regard. But as far as Warsaw is concerned, if I lived on the border right now with Ukraine and Russia, I would be keenly interested in arranging negotiations as soon as possible. Because the alternative, and let's be frank about this is very important for people to understand. The Russians, if they're not given some sort of security guarantee of neutrality for Ukraine in some fashion, they'll go all the way to the Polish border before they stop. I mean, what choice do they have? I mean, if they're constantly confronted with nothing but hostility and attacks and promises of future attacks, there's no incentive to do anything else. So I think people have begun to understand that. But the Russians, of course, as you know and I know, are not interested in governing Ukraine. They don't want to govern Western Ukraine, for God's sakes. I don't know why anybody would want to govern that place right now.
It's the Brzezinski effect and falling for the myth that the whole point of this entire war was to rebuild the Soviet Union. It's kind of hard for me to believe how people can believe in such baloney. I mean, I don't know what's stupider, people who still claim that Saddam's WMDs are hidden in Syria or that Putin wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. I have a hard time comparing those two, and they usually come from the same characters. But before we go into the battlefield aspects of all this, I don't know if you saw that CIA recruiting commercial that was posted on Telegram about 2 days ago. Chat, audience, if you haven't seen it, the Central Intelligence Agency, which seems to be a contradiction in terms these days, posted recruiting video on Telegram, on their new Telegram channel, aimed at Russians. encouraging dissident Russians and government officials to contact Langley and to basically betray their own country and to take Russia back, as they claim. Now, in my humble opinion, what's going to happen now is that the Russians are going to send a lot of double agents to the CIA to put them off balance, say, yes, I want to work for you guys. And the CIA is going to become even dumber and have less intelligence on Russia. So this ties in well with what we just talked about the narrative getting dumber, because the situation is getting worse. And I'm getting the impression that the billions that are flowing towards Langley right now are being used for such stupid projects instead of intelligence going to advancing actual interests of the American Republic. Your take, Doug.
Well, excuse me, the Central Intelligence Agency has been badly in need of, if not a dramatic overhaul, then being stripped down to the bare minimum structure and rebuilt from within. I think most people know that. The CIA has not provided us with the kind of intelligence that we could have used effectively in the past. And that's not to say that there aren't good people in the organization who do. Of course. The problem is that even when you have someone there who does good work, getting the good work to the people that need it is not very likely to happen. So I'm not surprised by any of it, although I must say that I thought this CIA approach, compared with so many others that I've seen in the past, was pretty good. It was clever. It raised the right questions. I can't imagine any Russian in his right mind buying into it, so I agree with you. If anybody shows up, they're probably sent in there with a mission. Here's the bad news for us. We've already got them anyway. Most of them, though, are Chinese. Right. And the thing at the end of the day is that I don't know how any of these double agents work very effectively, simply because we are so irrational. Our approach to everything is so incoherent, so impulsive. They must all throw up their arms in disgust, because what do you report back? Right. I recall somebody saying, during World War II, one of the Germans wrote in a memorandum, we've looked at U.S. military doctrine. We don't see much point in examining it because there's no evidence that anybody follows it. So I think you've got that kind of situation writ large now with Washington. Okay.
We have 9 brigades apparently poised to move to the east. So obviously there's no doubt that there's not going to be a breakthrough through Crimea. I mean, that's on par with a miracle. But just in terms of the blow that the Russians might take on those 3 defensive lines, or in the first defensive line that the Ukrainians want to send towards them. And we're obviously basing this statement on the fact that they still want to do this counteroffensive, that it seems feasible. Realistically, how far do you think the Ukrainians, with the equipment that they got, with the brigade structures and the fresh forces, can actually penetrate into the places in eastern Ukraine that are currently considered Russia by the Russians?
Well, let's look at the composition of this force. I think we're seeing large numbers of the 35,000 Ukrainian soldiers who are being trained in Great Britain, the Czech Republic, Germany, and other countries in NATO return to Ukraine. So conceivably, out of a force of what the Ukrainians claim could be 55,000, you could have conceivably 25 to 30,000 well-trained soldiers. That's for the Ukrainians, that's good news. Unfortunately, the bad news is it's only about 25,000. The rest of the people that would be part of this 55,000 counterattack offensive are people that are being pushed into the job. In other words, they're being picked up off the street, hastily trained, dragged in, young or older, hardly the best material from which to cobble together a dramatic counteroffensive. So what are they going to do? Well, they'd have to concentrate all of it at one key point. That's their best hope. Try to create a distraction elsewhere, try to create the illusion that there's a second supporting attack, but I just don't know how they would do it. And then devote whatever air defense assets they have, air and missile defense, to protect that, and then launch it at a particular point. Now, if they did that, they might gain some ground, because we know the Russians understand the utility of giving up ground. That's something that we've always miscalculated. We don't get it. We don't understand it. they're not going to defend every inch if they don't see any point to doing it, especially when they have such overwhelming superiority in attack, standoff attack, rockets, missiles, artillery ammunition. So what could happen? Well, they could gain some few thousand meters potentially in one area if they were lucky. What happens then? You report victory to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the London Times, say, look, we've broken through to these areas. And then eventually you come under enormous counterattack by the Russians along the lines that I just discussed. You end up essentially in a fire trap. Then you withdraw, leaving most of the equipment that you took in there behind you, which is destroyed, and hope that you get out with more than 60 or 70% of the people that you went in. What have you accomplished? Well, I think from Zelensky's standpoint, he's made his masters in Washington, London, New York City, and so forth happy. He's made his oligarchs happy. What does it do for Ukraine? I'm hard pressed to figure it out because, frankly, this is exactly what the Russians want. They want the Ukrainians to expend whatever they've got left in one big, massive effort. That makes it much easier for them to advance and take Odessa and Kharkov relatively quickly. And I suppose they'll sweep across most of eastern Ukraine on the east side of the Dnieper River anyway. Now, then the question is, what do you do? If you're President Putin, you're looking for someone to talk to. Is there anybody out there? Well, you mentioned that Warsaw is now privately saying, look, we've got to come to some sort of conclusion. I hope so, because I can tell you that Washington is going to do nothing. And I've always warned the Europeans of something, and no one's ever listened to it. We are not a continental power. We are not a land power anywhere but in our own hemisphere. We are primarily an aerospace and a maritime power, much like Great Britain. And what does that mean? When things ultimately go badly for us, we sail away. We fly away. We go home. I had this conversation years ago with Dave Petraeus. We were talking in 2005 in November about Iraq. And I said, why not just leave? And of course, he flew into a rage. Oh, we can't just leave. And all these terrible things will happen if we leave. And I said, but Dave, that's what we always do. Eventually, we'll just leave. And I think that's on the agenda now, very definitely for Biden and his friends in Washington. This is unsustainable over the long run. It was never sustainable for us. And so what are the Europeans going to do? Now, we have the Hungarians who are a little bit upset over the fact that the Ukrainians were thinking about destroying the gas lines from Russia. Not a good thing. We have the Poles who are saying we've had enough refugee influx. We don't need any more, and we'd like to get back to normality. Then in France, Zelensky, who's running around trying to collect more money, is being described by French journalists as a traveling circus. Well, I think it is. It's a giant facade. The question is, when does the facade collapse? And I was finally contacted yesterday by a demographer who said, when you said before Christmas that the numbers of people in Ukraine had dropped from 30.5 million at the beginning of this war down to somewheres in the neighborhood of between 18 and 24 million, I didn't believe you.
Yeah.
But he says he now sees evidence that there are no more than 20 million people in Ukraine. Well, what does this mean for the future? What's the consequence? And now we're talking already about the enormous explosion in Helmitsky. Everyone is upset over the fact that you have this gamma radiation. Nobody's pointing out that that's going to dissipate. The bigger problem are the alpha particles that could then ultimately end up in the ground. Now, how much, I don't know, but certainly not more than 40 or 50 square miles, but that's enough. That means 10 or 15 years have to pass before you can utilize any of that soil. So clearly, if I were living in Eastern Europe, I'd say enough is enough. We like it or not, we've got to talk to the Russians. And you've got to get back to this notion of neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't even think Monsanto would want to touch that soil when they get their hands on Ukraine. And we know they want to get their hands on Ukraine.
And a lot of other people.
And a lot of other people. Doug, we had an election, a presidential election in Turkey this past weekend, and we know they're going into the second round. I'm of the opinion, because I'm seeing so many signs now. Obviously, Turkey is playing it not for the advantage of Russia, but advantage Turkey first and foremost. Right. But it's hard for me to see if Erdogan wins this election. I make these bets sometimes with my friends. Who's going to be the first country that'll leave NATO? There a lot are saying Hungary. Some are saying the United States will collapse and that'll destroy NATO. But I'm saying that at the end of the day, it's going to be Erdogan's or some Turkish politicians' power play in the next decade or less that'll lead to the disintegration of NATO, as Turkey has, if I have my numbers correct, the second largest army in the alliance, which will create a whole different situation in the Mediterranean and so on and so on. What's your opinion on the potential effects of an emboldened and stronger Erdogan within the NATO alliance and vis-a-vis the entire situation currently ongoing in Ukraine?
Well, I think something's important to consider once again, that both President Putin and President Erdogan have turned out to be very cautious, thoughtful strategists. These are not impulsive personalities. They're the diametrically opposite personality types to what we have in Washington. No one is emoting in Ankara. No one is emoting in Moscow. So Erdogan is effectively taken his country largely out of NATO. We regard them, frankly, more and more as a quote unquote paper ally. I thought we should have gotten our forces out of Turkey, particularly the air forces and certainly the munitions, since we allegedly have some nuclear weapons still in Turkey, get them all out years ago. Because the rationale, the raison d'etre for NATO in the Mediterranean just doesn't exist any longer. There are new actors in the region. It's not just Turkey, it's also Israel. Israel now has interests in the Mediterranean that it did not previously have in terms of offshore oil and gas and drilling. Same thing is true for Egypt and Tunisia, other countries. Then you have Greece, of course, which also has interests. The bottom line is NATO no longer has the utility that it once did as preventing conflict. If conflict breaks out on a regional basis, it will be regional actors that ultimately solve it and end it, not NATO. So, but I don't think Mr. Erdogan needs to stand up and say, well, we've had it, we're leaving NATO. I mean, he can effectively do pretty much whatever he wants right now without concern about being punished for it. Again, the real question is NATO meaningful at all anymore? And that's the question we're going to answer over the next 6 months, I think, pretty emphatically.
Well, I heard a joke that once Turkey leaves, they're going to be made up by a very North Atlantic country, Japan, that's going to enter NATO. So, and we know that NATO is wanting in that respect because they're suddenly discovering new geographical locations, that China somehow is in the North Atlantic. And since we moved to China, you mentioned in one of the previous interviews, and I read this myself, that apparently an American admiral has made statements that the United States is ready for a two-front war, that we can somehow do this. Could you expand on that? Because I remember a former Austrian painter in the 30s who thought he could do the same, and that didn't turn out quite well for him.
Yeah. Two-front wars almost never do. And I don't think this man is related to the Austrian painter, but his name is Aquilino.
Right.
And maybe Mussolini. I don't know.
Right.
The bottom line is that he made a very irresponsible statement. We're ready for a two-front war as long as the two-front war lasts a week. In other words, after a week, all of your missiles and your capabilities to attack the enemy or counterattack the enemy are effectively exhausted. And this is back to the whole business in Ukraine from day one. Everyone marched into this thing believing Russia's weak. Russia is, quote unquote, Spain with a gas station. The Russians don't want to fight. The Russians won't do this, won't do that. They're incompetent, all this nonsense. This is the kind of mentality that is so dangerous, and that results in these irresponsible statements, because he effectively said, look, we've seen the Russians. We don't need to worry about them. And on the other hand, China, well, I think I have what I need to deal with China. This is the sort of thing that should never be stated in public. I think if Eisenhower were president, the man would have been sacked on the spot. these are not matters for discussion by senior officers in the military. These are matters for discussion by civilian heads of government. And even then, I think it would be extremely irresponsible to make such a statement. If we've learned anything from our experience in Ukraine, it has to be the enormous requirement to prepare for war. In other words, we and NATO have simply given up being prepared for real warfare. And we gave that up, I would argue, 30 years ago. And so now when President Biden or anybody in the Senate says, well, how many tanks can we get next week, or how many artillery rounds, or how many missiles, everybody's discovering that we have very limited capacity. In fact, we have almost no surge capacity. What you've seen in Russia is a surging capacity inside its military industrial complex. That's something we don't have. I'm sure the Chinese could do it. But if we're going to talk stupidly about conflict with people in the future, we'd better go back and examine what we can actually do. So I think this admiral should have kept his mouth shut. Because as I say, as long as it lasts a week, we can do anything. After a week, we're in a lot of trouble.
I think it might have been on the Duran with Amir Curtis and Alice Christopher. There was one of the gentlemen made a statement that apparently there's only one factory in the United States that produces tanks. I don't know if you can corroborate that. Apparently somewhere in the
No, that's true. That's true.
Right. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about a surge whereby the Russians are in effect for a few months now in war economy mode. And we're still, the West in general, still in a mode like George W. Bush after 9/11. Go shopping, have fun, enjoy your freedoms. Nothing's changed. So it's the same dynamic, basically. But the chickens are coming home to roost for sure. And it's interesting that I think both of these summits, because the NATO summit that's going to be taking place in Vilnius is also scheduled for June. And the BRICS associated summit, the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, is going to take place also in June. So we're going to be seeing two parallel universes, in my opinion, one based in reality on the potential of what could be without Western dominance, and a bunch of people, well, maybe Erdogan will be the exception, but I don't think he's going to be having too much fun at the deliberations, along with Orban, of patting themselves on the back and saying, yeah, we just need to do a little bit more, but wait a minute, on the other hand, we can't give any more. So I think there might be a lot of comedy coming out of this NATO summit, because apart from printed money, there's not much else that, I mean, nobody's considering nuclear weapons, obviously. Some people are talking F-16s, but I've noticed that there's less military officer input into what we can give Ukraine, as was the case for the first couple of months, where you had officers talking, yeah, we should give this, this, and this, and politicians, just civilians, saying yes, like Rishi Sunak right now making that agreement. I think it was with the Netherlands. Yes, we're going to be procuring and sending F-16. So now it's just become a war totally devoid of any input from possibly officers, and it's just a political power play at this point. Because, I mean, what are you going to do with those F-16s, right, in Ukraine?
Well, imagine if you're sitting in Vilnius or in St. Petersburg, and while you're sitting there, you discover that Russian forces have now moved to the Dnieper River, have crossed bridges, and are headed down into Odessa. And at the same time, Russian forces are now breaking out of Bakhmut and headed towards Kharkov, ready to turn west towards the river again, where Kiev sits. Remember, the Russians also destroyed one of the most important bridges over the river that borders Ukraine and Moldova.
Right.
Nobody paid any attention to that. There are actually two bridges. One's a rail bridge, and then there's a traffic bridge. Traffic bridge is extremely important, because it can sustain and hold and carry all the heavy military traffic. With that out of business, you're not going to get into Ukraine from the southwest of Ukraine anymore. And listen, we've got a lot of troops in Romania. There was lots of talk about moving through Moldova and down into Ukraine. I think that's gone. That option is gone. If we try to do it, it would be disastrous. So that leaves Poland as a single theater where you've got lots of American troops and lots of Polish troops. But if you're sitting in either of these places and the Russians are advancing, who wins that particular outcome? I mean, obviously, if you're in Vilnius and the Russians are advancing, it's a very uncomfortable feeling. If you're in St. Petersburg and you're talking about going to gold-backed currency in a new world led largely by China, Russia, and India, well, that's an extremely good feeling. I think that's where we're headed.
Moving stateside, because I've noticed that there's an interesting phenomenon, which is characteristic of the upcoming presidential race, where you have, with all their imperfections and perfections, but you have two candidates basically, and you worked for one and the other one interviewed you recently. We're talking about Donald Trump and Robert Kennedy Jr., and they're framing the situation in basically the terms that we discuss here on Votum TV and a lot of other dissidents discuss with you and other channels and podcasts. But when Trump was asked recently at that CNN town hall, whose side are you rooting for? And I think he made a very profound statement. I'm saying this sincerely. He says, the important thing right now is to stop the killing, which people would say, oh, but Trump is bullish. He's a blowhard. And all of a sudden he becomes this humanitarian, which I think was sincere, because the important thing you have to do right now, considering the slaughterhouse that Ukraine is you got to stop the killing. And then you have Robert Kennedy Jr., who's going even deeper into the issues and talking about NATO expansion and all the other aspects that contributed to this war. And I'm thinking, if that isn't a sign in some way, obviously, that some good can still happen in the political realm in the United States, especially that, Donald Trump has been exonerated right now. Bobby is doing pretty well in the polls, considering he's a first timer and he's fairly fresh. And the panic on a lot of other people's sides. I mean, Biden has said he's not going to have any debates, because why? He's the incumbent. Are you seeing any political signs of hope in the United States on the level of electoral politics, having to consider they have two candidates who are basically speaking our speak, so to say, or the truth on Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I think both men, both Robert Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump, understand that for Americans, for us, this is not a question of sides. But you're talking about men who have not decided that Russia is the mortal enemy of all things good on the planet. In other words, they see Russia as a major power, someone with whom we want to do business, someone with whom we want to get along, someone who has legitimate security interests. We also see Ukraine as a state with legitimate security interests. And so they've come to the conclusion, this is not about winning and losing anymore. It's about stop the bleeding, and halt the killing if you can do it. That's a good sign, and I think it's very sincere. There is no one in Washington that I am aware of who is interested in that. They are all opposed to it. Now, when I say all, I'm sure you can find some Republicans and a handful of Democrats that agree with both RFK and Donald Trump, but the vast majority of people here don't. And remember, no one wants to stand up and say, gee, we miscalculated. We didn't understand what we were doing. Remember, we finally said that in the 70s after Vietnam had ended. McNamara said, well, we didn't understand the culture. Well, you idiot. There were a lot of people that understood exactly what was going on. You wouldn't listen to them. That's the same problem now. Now, beyond that, you've got a different kind of problem. I don't know if anybody there has followed Governor DeSantis, who was being lauded as a potential Republican candidate. He was, of course, endorsed by George Soros. And unsurprisingly, after saying initially we have no vital strategic interest in Ukraine that would justify the use of American military power there or any involvement, 2.5 days later, he came back. Oh, I was wrong. My donors called me and told me I was wrong. Right now, we have government by donors, rich, powerful figures on the left, huge quantities of money who are pouring it in to whomever they need to get the outcome they want. So the whole Republican facade that we are somehow or another essentially democratic has fallen. I think people are beginning to see, how do you elect yourself out of this mess? I don't know. I mean, this is something we're going to find out over the next 12 to 24 months. Can we actually hold fair and free elections that are not corrupted? I mean, how do you get around this absentee ballot insanity? How do you stop the influence of someone like Zuckerberg, who moves into blue state cities, big cities around the country, spends $450 million to effectively support actions that we largely would regard as, if not illegal, then certainly wrong. And in some cases, the stuffing of ballot boxes with large numbers of absentee ballots. I remember the last election, I was getting calls from people in Las Vegas saying that in the lobbies of hotels and casinos, there were ballots everywhere. All you had to do was fill it out and stuff it into the box. No one bothered to look carefully at any of it. So the question is, can we even hold an election that's going to be valid in the thinking and the eyes of the American people? That I don't know. And we are distracted ultimately by a lot of other things. The top priority, I would say, for most people right now, other than trying to deal with the economic issues that are not going to go away quickly, given the fact that it took years for us to get to this point, is obviously the border. No security for the country on its borders. People are being brought in. I mean, you and others have pointed out how well Ukrainian refugees have been treated. Well, I would tell you that these people coming into the country are receiving benefits and support that Americans can't get. It's very strange. So these things are a big issue. And then, of course, there's criminality in the big cities. No one's willing to enforce the law anymore. If you enforce the law, you have a high probability of being attacked for doing so. So these are the number one priorities here, not what's happening overseas. The bad news, again, is that Americans are not looking carefully at what's going on overseas. They don't understand the potentialities for real disaster. I hope that the Europeans will wake up. I keep hoping that we'll see some governments change. I know the Germans have really, really had it with Scholz. There's no doubt about that. But I see no action. You've got to get a new government. You've got to get new leadership, steps up and says, that's it. And how do you recover economically without cheap energy? Cheap energy is the lifeblood of civilization. We can do it, but it's going to take us time. It'll take us about 5 years to recover from the damage that's been done over the last 2.
Well, it's sort of an escape from LA or an escape from New York scenario, what happening before our eyes. But I think I speak for a lot of Polish patriots or rational thinking Poles who say, all those boys from Kansas, all those guys on the strikers, we sure as hell don't need them in Poland. You guys need them on your own border with Mexico. So we would like to make a formal request to all the American commanders in Poland. Do your duty. Go back to the United States and defend your own border. We love you guys, but we really don't need you here stirring up a war. Defend your own border. Indeed, America first all the way. Doug, thank you very much. You've been very generous with your time today. For all our audiences, give us a like, a sub. We'll obviously be seeing Colonel Macgregor soon, I hope. I hope you all have a great day. And once again, Doug, thank you for having the time and courtesy of joining us today.
Sure. Thank you, Mikhail.